Hey friends, Azure is a great cloud platform, but some workloads are still best served on premises, which is why many people are now using hyper-converged infrastructure, or HCI. Azure Stack HCI is a host operating system delivered as an Azure service, which means it's always up to date and you can manage it all from the Azure portal. Cosmos Darwin is here to show me how it works today on Azure Friday. Hey friends, I'm Scott Hanselman, and it's another episode of Azure Friday. I'm here with Cosmos Darwin, and we're talking about Azure HCI, and I think you brought some wonderful toys behind you there on the desk. How are you?
I did. I'm doing well, Scott. Thank you. How are you?
I am lovely, and I'm thrilled to be talking to you because I want to learn all about what Azure Stack HCI is.
Yeah, well, it was pretty big news last week at Microsoft Inspire. It's a new cloud service from Microsoft Azure that provides a new way for customers to run virtual machines on their premises. So it's an HCI software stack that you install on your servers, but then you can manage it and other things through the Microsoft Azure cloud.
Okay, so when we say HCI and CI, what does that mean for people who aren't familiar?
Good question. So HCI stands for Hyper-Converged Infrastructure. It's really, in recent years, become the normal way to deploy new servers. The idea, if you want to think of it this way, is that your virtualization hosts, where you're actually running your VMs, kind of bring their own storage and bring their own networking. So it means you don't need a separate storage array or SAN or NAS anymore. You can often have fewer network appliances as well. So overall, HCI kind of helps you simplify how you operate your data center, tends to increase performance and tends to reduce costs too.
Yeah, interesting. I remember when virtual machines first came out and there were specs on exactly what you needed to do. And here's a whole plan, a blueprint for exactly what you need to do to make your installation, your physical installation, match the requirements of what it was to run a VM. This is 20 plus years ago. Now it seems like the software is flexible enough that it can pretty much use whatever we throw at it and kind of levels the playing field.
Yeah, there was an element of what you're describing in the early days of HCI as well. So it's been a few years since hyper-converged infrastructure kind of started to become really prevalent. Nowadays, we see it as the normal way people deploy new servers, from core data center to branch offices and edge locations. And initially, the hardware bill of materials was pretty prescribed. You had to be pretty careful. These days, as you'll see with Azure Stack HCI, I mean, you can really run this on an immense variety of different systems. So as a customer, you can choose hardware that suits your needs.
Now, this might be an oversimplification, but that's what all good analogies are. Am I bringing a tiny sliver of Azure to myself when I run a little Azure in my home office?
Yeah, you can think of it that way. Actually, a good way to unpack Azure Stack HCI is kind of as two things. First of all, it's an HCI software stack. And then second of all, it's delivered as an Azure service. And you're sort of getting into the second one a little bit with your question. The ways in which sort of what we mean when we say it's delivered as an Azure service is, as a customer, you see this in the Azure portal. You pay for this through your existing Azure subscription. You get support for it on your existing Azure support contract. And so in many, many ways, this looks and feels and behaves just like any other cloud service that you would use from Azure. It just happens to be that the substance of this service is Azure's latest hypervisor with built-in software-defined storage and networking, which you run on your servers on your premises.
Wow, that is amazing.
Yeah, we're seeing an awful lot of interest from customers, and it kind of makes sense, right? There's a huge move where most workloads are moving into a public cloud. But at the same time, customers, are very clear-eyed that they have certain applications or certain things that are going to remain on-prem, possibly forever, right? There are good and durable reasons, whether it's data sovereignty or latency or things like that. And that's really where the Azure Stack portfolio of products comes in. So we've already talked about Azure Stack Hub and Azure Stack Edge. Azure Stack HCI is just the newest member of this family. And they're all really toward that aim of helping customers to keep the workloads on-prem that need to stay there while still taking advantage of cloud-based management and other cloud-based advantages, because those advantages are really clear even when the workloads are on-prem.
Is this what we are talking about when we say hybrid cloud? It's that relationship between a cloud that is kind of infinitely scalable in the cloud elsewhere, someone else's computers, and then something that's happening on-prem, whether it be classic virtual machines or a more formal Azure HCI stack.
Yeah, absolutely. Hybrid is the perfect word. When we talk with customers, what we hear is increasingly their plans for the future are they envision their IT infrastructure to sort of straddle some amount of things running on-prem, other things running up in the public cloud. And they really want a single control plane that they can use to sort of manage all of that IT estate. And that's one of the big things that you get with Azure Stack HCI is although the cluster physically sits on your premises, you can actually control it through the Azure portal. In fact, I can give you a demo of that if you like.
Let's do it. Let's see it.
Yeah. So what I'm going to show you here is the out-of-the-box behavior with an Azure Stack HCI. So I've installed Azure Stack HCI on 2 servers. I haven't had to pull down an agent. I haven't had to run a big complicated script. And yet, in spite of having not done any of those things, what you'll see is I can just go to the public cloud Azure portal and I'll see my Azure Stack HCI. So in my browser, I'm going to go to portal.azure.com. And this is just the regular Azure portal on the public internet. So if you're an Azure user, you've seen this before. It's very familiar. What you haven't seen is this new Azure Stack HCI cloud service. This is a new resource provider built by Microsoft that's actually projecting my on-premises HCI up into the Azure Resource Manager, into ARM as a first-class Azure resource.
Oh, wow.
So I can click on one of them, for example. Here's my Contoso HCI cluster. And you'll see that this is, directly in the Azure portal. I get some nice information about this cluster. So I can see that it's got 2 server nodes. I can see things like the software version that it's running, how many physical cores it has, things like that. It's connected to Azure. And then this is just the beginning. This view is going to get richer over time as the team builds out more information and more management options on this page. But even already, there's quite a few things that you can do here. Things where really Azure Stack HCI is benefiting from all the standard constructs of Azure Resource Manager. So for example, I can tag my clusters. I can organize them into resource groups. I can easily attribute the consumption of different clusters into different departments within my organization. We know that Azure customers love Azure support, so I can click on new support requests right here and actually use Azure to access self-help resources or initiate a new support ticket for this cluster. So in a lot of ways, this looks and feels like something that's running in the public cloud, even though in reality, these servers are on my premises.
That's amazing. So it's a proxied resource manager. They are, Azure thinks of them as resources in Azure because they are resources in Azure. They're just elsewhere.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Essentially, you can think of it as us projecting what is sitting outside of Azure into Azure. If that sounds familiar, it's because we've talked about that a lot in the context of Azure Arc. And one way to think about Azure Stack HCI is that it's an HCI stack from Azure that has Arc built in. So there's no agent. It just does this natively.
Wow. And then the billing goes directly to my Azure subscription because it's all part of Azure.
Absolutely. Yep. So if you're one of the 95% of the Fortune 500 who already use Azure, this is extremely frictionless to get started.
Mm-hmm. And is it expensive?
It's a good question. No, actually. And we'll talk about that in just a moment when I give you a sneak peek into what's in this box here behind me. There is a second thing I want to cover, if I may, on
Please.
The subject of frictionlessness. So, this is the out-of-the-box experience where it just kind of shows up in the portal. But there's also a ton of hybrid management services in Azure that I can use with Azure Stack HCI. It really makes it pretty easy for me to start taking advantage of other capabilities that exist in Azure. So one of them, for example, is replicating virtual machines. Now, HCI is all about running virtual machines. That's what you do on a hyper-converged infrastructure. So how can you protect those virtual machines without anything complicated to set up? And the answer is you can actually use Azure for that. So I'll give you a quick example of what I mean here. Here's the user interface for Azure Stack HCI. I can see all of my virtual machines, and I can actually select one of them. And you'll see there's all the standard actions that I expect, like start, stop, but there's also actions that are behind the scenes backed by the public cloud. So for example, if I want to protect this VM, behind the scenes, that's going to use Azure Site Recovery. Now, because it's Azure Stack HCI, I'm already signed in. It knows who I am. There's nothing complicated that I need to jump around or set up. I can just click protect. And you can see here in the Azure portal, this virtual machine is being protected. It's being backed up to the Azure cloud, really in a way that is completely native to the product. There's nothing that I need to bolt together or build here. It's an HCI stack that is hybrid by design, by nature, if you will.
Wow. So that is just like I would protect any VM. It's just that one happens to be local to me.
Exactly. Yep. You can use many of the same management services, whether it's Azure Monitor or Azure Update Management. The things that you use for virtual machines today in Azure, you can use for these virtual machines, even though they're sitting on a cluster on your premises.
Wow. Yeah. Azure Monitor was going to be one of my next questions, that it's all part of Azure because it's all a resource within the Azure ARM family of resources.
Yep, absolutely. And that's actually one of my favorites. The extension to set up log analytics on top of these Arc-enabled clusters is really, really easy, actually.
Okay. So talk to me about the wooden box you've been teasing me with.
If you insist. So what I have here is a technology demonstration from one of our partners for Azure Stack HCI. Let me say first, it's not a commercially available product. It is really a technology demonstration, but it's pretty cool. It's some pretty groundbreaking hardware engineering, and that's why I wanted to share it with you. So what I have here is a bespoke, handcrafted wooden box. And what's going on inside is it's actually a fully self-contained, battery-powered Azure Stack HCI. I can give you a sense for sort of what some of the components are that are inside here. There's actually 2 servers within this wooden box. Each of them has an AMD EPYC processor with 2 cores. Each of them has 64 gigs of DDR4 error-correcting memory. Each of them has 4 NVMe SSDs for super fast storage. And they're directly connected to one another with dual 10 gigabit crossover Ethernet. So this is server-class hardware. But clearly, it's in a kind of unconventional form factor, right? Having everything in this little wooden box is not what you would have thought of initially when you think of HCI. Normally, you'd think of rack mount servers in a data center, but it doesn't have to be big and heavy and expensive. It can be a wooden briefcase.
That's amazing. It makes me think of you imagine like an Indiana Jones type out at the dig site with their tough book, and they've got their laptop, and we brought all the compute to us, but you're actually bringing a slice of the cloud itself out to the work site, and you're doing the processing there, whether it be AI or anything you could put into a virtual machine.
Yeah, that's actually a great point you raised, which is you can run anything you can put into a virtual machine on top of an Azure Stack HCI. So whether it's a Windows or a Linux virtual machine, if you want to run IoT Edge or some kind of custom line of business application or a high performance SQL server, again, this is like even just this wooden cluster is actually all flash storage. So it's very, very fast.
Wow.
And what's great about it is these internals, I mean, this is kind of the opposite of a rugged system because it's handcrafted wood. But you can get these internals from server vendors like SecureGuard and others in actually a proper ruggedized form factor, and then it's perfect for putting in retail stores or field sites or branch offices where things are maybe not quite as controlled an environment as they would be in a data center.
The retail stores one is a great example. If you had a whole series of stores and it all has a central cloud, you don't want the cloud going down to ruin it for everybody. So you take a slice of the cloud, you move it out to the edge, and everyone does their work with their local cloud, their AI training of the shelves. I mean, all the things you could do if you had that kind of compute. That's not a laptop in a wooden box. That's 2 server class systems in a wooden box.
Yeah, and actually your example with retail is a really, really good one to circle back to something you brought up earlier, which is the price point, right? If you're a retailer and you have hundreds or thousands of locations, you're pretty sensitive to the per location cost of each of these systems. And so that's where I think it's important to emphasize that Azure Stack HCI is actually not a device from Microsoft per se. It's a software service from Microsoft that the customer can install on whatever device they think is appropriate. So there are over 200 different server solutions that have been validated for Azure Stack HCI. Each of these can be configured in a number of different ways. And so you can get the entry price point for the minimum configuration down actually really, really affordable. Like this, example that I have here is single-digit thousands for the full self-contained system, including both of the servers. And then, so it doesn't have to break the bank from the hardware perspective, but it also doesn't have to break the bank from the software perspective, because the software for Azure Stack HCI is just a flat rate per physical processor core of $10 per month. So for this system, for example, this is 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a 4-core Azure Stack HCI. It's $40 a month. So you can imagine putting that into all of the different locations for a retailer. It's a much more appealing proposition than looking at like the upfront licensing from what you would typically think of as HCI.
Wow, that's amazing. And that's one of the things I like about doing a show like Azure Friday is when someone is watching this show right now, I'm hoping that they're going, I had no idea that this was a thing. And now this is a thing that I want for my business, for my company, for my whatever. And they're going to go and explore this and learn more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if folks are interested in getting hands-on with, well, you can't have my wooden cluster, but you can get hands-on with Azure Stack HCI, actually starting right now. So as of last week at Microsoft Inspire, Azure Stack HCI is in public preview. You can go sign up and try it right now at azure.com/HCI. Or if you just want to hear more about the wooden box, you can actually read the blog from our friends at SecureGuard at aka.ms/cluster in a wooden box CIWB.
Fantastic. I am learning all about Azure Stack HCI today on Azure Friday. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Azure Friday. Now I need you to like it, comment on it, tell your friends, retweet it. Watch more Azure Friday.